My heartfelt thanks for the invitation to offer some reflections under the auspices of the Aquinas Lecture. Thanks to Brother Richard and Brother Albert for their arrangements and hospitality, and my thanks too to Father David for introducing me today. We spent some time together some years ago when Father David was doing his MPhil, MA in theology. He was writing on Joseph Pieper, and I think the notion of silence was important in his thesis. Unfortunately, I can't be silent here today, so I have to speak. And the theme of the seminar, I was offered the freedom to choose what theme I would like, but my eye fell on the notion of the importance of interdependence as the ongoing theme for the seminar here, culminating with the discussion of Aquinas on the development of the law. And the notion of the interdependence caught my eye, since perhaps certainly one of the central notions in the work that I've been developing is the notion of the between, the Metaxu, and hence the title Communities of the Metaxu. Metaxu as Greek for between, inter in Latin. And in some of the things that I want to offer to you tonight, I want to take up the dyad of dependence and independence and say something about how, in certain ways, an understanding of both those two define our sense of modern freedom, turning around the notion of autonomy. And while the sense of interdependence is acknowledged, and acknowledged to be very important, I want to say that the of interdependence really requires terms other than just dependence and independence to do justice to what's at stake. First of all, I want to say just a word or two about Aquinas. I can claim no specialized scholarly knowledge of Aquinas, but I would say that my relation to him is one that I would call companioning. One can have different relations to thinkers. Some one might make more the object of scholarly research, philological investigation, but there can be thinkers that are companions in the sense of providing a note of inspiration in your own researches, in your own investigations. They may not always appear in the explicit foreground of what you're doing, but they may be accompanying you in a variety of ways in a more recessed modality. I think of Aquinas as a companion to my thinking in that sense. And one of the themes, one of the thoughts that I want to offer today is the notion of communities as said in many senses. Again, those of you who are metaphysicians know how Aristotle talks about being as said in many senses, echoed by Aquinas, but the of interdependence also, I think, calls for many senses. And just to say a word or two about Aquinas, this notion of a between community, there's a certain sense in which there are a variety of different communities in Thomas's way of looking at things. Perhaps in other great Christian thinkers also, like Augustine, the sense of, first of all, absolute community. By this I mean the Trinitarian community, that is the immanent life of the divine, between God and God, in the interior intermediation of Father, Son, and Spirit. So this is an immanently intermediated togetherness of a community of divine persons. This is the community of agape as absolute. Now again, I don't speak officially as a theologian, but there's a certain sense in which this notion of the Metaxu also can be turned to, I think, Trinitarian thoughts. And then relative senses of between communities. A community not just within the divinity, but between God and creation. Further, relative communities, and in a certain sense all communities are relative in the sense of being gatherings of forms of relation, of being in relation. Further relative communities are being given to be. That being is given to be a community between beings in creation. Or further again, a community between creation and the human being. Further yet again, there is relative community, better communities between human beings. I'll return to some of these below when I talk about the family, something in a very loose sense corresponding to work and the economy, the sense of the polity, and the sense of the ethical religious community. And finally, there is community between human beings and God. This last community, as a relative community, is a community constituted by the absolute relation between the human and the divine. More standardly within the Christian tradition, we tend to think of this in terms of grace and the church, and think of it as in some mysterious way redeeming the community of creation. Now, this way of talking may not be exactly Aquinas' own. I'm aware of that. But again, my point here would be to say that the inter is spoken in many senses. Dicitur multiplicitur, again to echo Aquinas' echoing of Aristotle's to on legatai polakos. So first of all, let me just say something about the metaxu. Again, I'm starting off in a certain sense with very abstract considerations, but I will try to indicate that they're not just merely abstract. So I tried to distinguish this notion of the metaxu by contrast with the univocal sense of being, the equivocal sense of being, and the dialectical sense of being. And again, very, very simply, a univocal approach tends to want to reduce differences to a unity, as precise as possible. An equivocal orientation tends to have a feel for the ambiguities of things, and sometimes mediates those, sometimes does not quite mediate those differences into a sense of a togetherness that one might call a community. The dialectical sense is again a mediation between the univocal and the equivocal, but particularly the modern sense of dialectic, and again I've been a long student of Hegel's sense of dialectic, there is an interplay between sameness and otherness, but in the final account of things, self-mediation tends to include differences, multiplicities within itself. This sense of the metaxological that I've been trying to develop, a logos of the metaxu, is a return to this between space. And it's not a rejection of the univocal, the equivocal, or the dialectical, but it's claiming that in that between space there are plurivocal intermediations. And that particularly in the modern sense of dialectic with Hegel, the sense of otherness has been reconfigured in such a way that it becomes part of a more inclusive totality. So I try to argue that there's an openness to this to this metaxu, that has to be plurally investigated. And again, in the course of my own intellectual journeys, I've tried to do that in a variety of different mediums. Now, again, the abstractness of, of these particular formulations, I think, will be reflected in some of the things that I say later, but hopefully they won't be quite as abstract as this initial formulation. I've often been asked by Thomists, where is analogy in all of this? Because again, in Aristotle, and again echoed by Aquinas, you have univocity, equivocity, and then analogy. Now, I've tried to claim that what I call metaxology is, in a sense, a post-dialectical revision of what I take to be one of the essential dimensions of the analogical orientation to things. And in that analogical orientation, it's not just the similitude of the different, but rather the affirmation that there is a dissimilitude that in the end exceeds the similitude. So that sense of excessive dissimilitude, in one sense, seems to just blow things open in the direction of an equivocity, where in the end we really can't make sense of things. But openness to that dissimilitude is, in my sense of the between, absolutely essential in preventing the closure of something like a Hegelian totality. And again, I'll just touch on the subject here today. It's particularly of great relevance in relation to the relationship between the finite and the infinite, and between, let's say, the human and the divine. Because that sense of, let's call it excessive otherness or transcendence, that is so marked within the monotheistic traditions, which again, of course, allows for mediations and a between. In Hegel's case, his deployment of dialectic tends to, as it were, bring that transcendence back to an immanent whole, and hence departs from that sense of the ultimate mystery of the divine, as always more. But again, that's a topic that we can take up in conversation. So let me now just turn to the notion of interdependence, but with reference to dependence and independence. Sometimes when you have the three words side by side, you have, did I say independence or did I say interdependence? But in some ways, dependence and independence can be correlated with what I take to be two extremely influential notions in modernity, namely autonomy and heteronomy. Dependence as corresponding to a sense of heteronomy, independence as answering to the notion of autonomy. And I think one could make the claim that in modernity, generally, all substantive goods, whether in the medieval sense or in the classically Greek sense, have come under critique in some form or other. The only absolute or quasi-absolute that seems to escape this is the notion of freedom. Freedom is invested with a kind of primacy that is notable, but my point would be this, that we have often come to think of freedom in terms of the notion of autonomy. Now again, in a relative sense there's something right about that, but in a larger sense the danger is that if we univocalize the notion of freedom just to autonomy, we run serious risks of not doing justice to the relationship between autonomy and perhaps forms of freedom that may be prior to autonomy, and perhaps forms of freedom that may be beyond autonomy. Freedom itself may also be a plurivocal notion, but we have had a tendency which gets expressed in the very concrete life of Western societies in particular, where the univocalization of autonomy has produced the reconstruction of the world in its own way. So let me here just say a word or two about Kant. Kant, again, one of the great figures of modernity, who defines the essence of morality by this contrast between autonomy and heteronomy. And heteronomy for him, on the one hand, could be natural heteronomy, where the human being, as a creature of nature, is determined externally by forces in nature. And for Kant, if that is the case, then there is no ground of morality as such. Kant is a defender of freedom, but autonomy is other to heteronomy in that natural sense, precisely because instead of being a nomos of to heteron, a law of the other, autonomy is a nomos of to auto, the law of the self or the law of the same. So again, you can see this as very continuous with what has sometimes been called this turn to the self, that is considered to be a major characteristic of modernity. And they correlate in a certain sense with dependence and independence. If you're autonomous, you're independent. If you're heteronomous, you're dependent. You may be dependent upon natural factors and forces, and to the extent that you are, you're not genuinely a human in the properly moral sense, only if you're autonomous and self-determining. Have you that independence from external determination that constitutes your your essential nature as a moral being. Again, I would say the problem is something like this, to bring in the third term, the notion of interdependence, or the notion of the inter. Kant is very aware that one of the difficulties this contrast of heteronomy and autonomy is going to run into is precisely how a plurality of moral subjects relate to each other. I'm autonomous, you're autonomous, but what are we to do with the community that brings together a plurality of autonomous moral beings? And again, those of you who are Kant scholars will know that his famous kingdom of ends, in a sense, is his answer to that. Each of us is an end in ourselves. And that there's a kingdom of ends in which this togetherness of autonomous moral subjects can, as an ideal, be thought of. Now, my question is this. If the nature of freedom is autonomy, how do you speak about the space between autonomous subjects? And the question is whether the logic of autonomy can do justice to that between space. Because the logic of autonomy, again, is primarily referenced with respect to my self-determination, your self-determination. But the middle space between self-determining subjects seems to contain essential dimensions that are not subject to a logic of self-determination. So what is that other logic to be that will do justice to this, if you like? You can call it interdependence, but I'm just stressing the inter now. Can it just be autonomy once again? And if it has to be something other, do we have to rethink the nature of freedom then as other to autonomy when it comes to this between community, which is again at least acknowledged as an ideal by Kant himself. One response to that issue, though again it's not formulated exactly in those terms by him, is Hegel's efforts to, as it were, expand the range of reference of self-determination, that somehow it includes the relation to the other within itself. So you can see Hegel as both continuous and in some ways departing from Kant. So again, the notions of dependence and independence come in here, and his famous dialectic of master and slave, some of you will be familiar with it, the struggle for recognition in Hegel's phenomenology very much takes up this particular issue, that Kant is wrong to have a simple dyadic contrast between autonomy and heteronomy. Again, if you have a very univocalizing mind, you'll say autonomy is autonomy, heteronomy is heteronomy. But if we have to think the middle space between them, then we can't just have a univocal sense of autonomy or a univocal sense of heteronomy. So I think that this is part of the insight of Hegel on this particular score, that somehow we do have to think the between space. How he thinks it, again, this is very, very famous discussion influencing Marx and many more in the 19th century and having a huge influence, particularly in French thought in the 20th century. There's a struggle for recognition, and recognition, of course, already contains two, let's say, at least at a minimum, two beings. Hegel talks about the servant and the master. And his own account is very striking, and it goes something like this. The master as the independent consciousness stands over against the slave as the dependent consciousness. But when we think the matter through dialectically, we realize, in fact, that the independent consciousness, that is to say the master, could not be the master without the work of the dependent consciousness. So if we think the full happening of their interplay through, we discover, in fact, the enjoyment of the master is impossible without the work of the slave, the servant. And further again, in a certain sense, the master is impotent without the slave, precisely because of his dependency upon the so-called dependent consciousness. So the independent consciousness shows at a deeper level of reflection to be the dependent consciousness. And if we approach the relationship from the other side, we see that the dependent consciousness, that is to say the servant, who is the working term of this partnership, by his power of work, he transforms the situation into something that enables something that previously was not possible. The servant transforms the given, and by working, he comes to realize in some sense or other that he has a certain power over the situation that the enjoying independent consciousness does not have. So by a kind of cunning of the dialectic, so to say, the dependent consciousness turns out to be the one who can work his way to independence. Now again, I think that this is a masterful discussion of a certain type of interplay. The tendency has been to take that as a full account of what it would mean to be involved in a process of mutual recognition. And this is where I would raise some questions about it. Just some of them. One of them is that Hegel understands this interdependence really in very agonistic terms. It is a struggle after all. And again, I don't think that one has to deny that much of human social relations are full of struggle. But the issue here really is whether dialectical struggle constitutes the essence of what it means to be in an intermediated relation with others. And of course, if there is a kind of, again, to use the Greek, a polemical edge to the agon in a reformed Heraclitean sense. You recall Heraclitus, polemos is the father of all things, the sense that being itself is simply struggle. Your sense of, or interdependence as human beings then, will tend to be marked by a kind of negative note. And the question really will be, can one generate a community of peaceful recognition out of terms that themselves, at their very base, are defined by agonistic and polemical, or warlike? Can you, what kind of peace comes out of war? Certainly some kinds of peace come out of war, but there are different kinds of pieces also. So that's one particular question that I would put to the Hegelian view. Another one would be the following, and I've put this to some of my Hegelian friends on occasion. It's a masterful dialectical account of mutual recognition. I recognize the other recognizes me. In my recognize the other, I come to recognize myself in and through the other. The other, in recognizing me, comes to recognize himself in and through the other. In a certain sense, there's a symmetry between the two sides of relation. And for Hegel, that is a sign of a logic of self-mediation in and through the other, which yields a kind of the ability to let the other go, so to say. And I've asked the question whether this dialectic could be mapped equally onto a process of mutual love as well as a process of mutual hatred. Again, one can see, or a tendency to think that this recognition will be in the side of the love column, so to say. I recognize you, you recognize me, we come together, we also allow ourselves to be free, and so on. But there can be simulations of love which take the character of mutual hatred that, in a certain sense, look dialectically exactly the same. But the energy of being, so to say, that circulates in the dialectic does so in opposite directions. And so the directionality of the love is an interesting question to pose to something like Hegel's effort to give a logos of the between. If I'm right, if in fact there is a kind of parodic mimesis between the structure of mutual recognition considered as love and a mutual recognition, so to say, considered as hatred. But a last point I'll just say here is that Hegel tends to want to talk about mutual mediations. So instead of independence, dependence, each of us is in interplay with the other such that if I determine you, you determine me, so there's a mutual mediation. Now again, this is a very large question, I understand that, but my point will be this: Hegel's efforts to think mutual determination tends to be in the end overcome by a logic of an inclusive self-mediation. And I'll just make one reference. In Hegel's philosophy of right, which has had huge historical significance in its own way, he defines freedom as the free will that wills the free will. The free will that wills the free will. So I think of it as a kind of practical form of the Aristotelian God, the thought that thinks itself, thought, thinking, 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 willing, willing, willing. But it's in the end a form of Geist as self, willing itself. And this whole question of what is other to self becomes equivocally recessed in the logic of his philosophy of right, which again is acknowledged to be one of the great works in ethics and political theory. So in other words, in the end, Hegel is not an awful lot different. There's the line of continuity with Kant, in which a more inclusive form of autonomous self-determination takes all heteronomies into itself. And hence that sense of interdependence at least could be said to be weakened by that. Okay, so where do we go from here? What I want to propose is something like the following: that this modern sense of independence is very much defined by, again, calling on some thinkers like Hobbes and Spinoza, for instance, talk about the essence of a being as its conatus, the notion of a conatus essendi, that to be is to be an affirmation of being, to be is to be an endeavor to be. And it takes a particular form in modernity, and it has its own influences in political theory and so on. But what I want to suggest is that there's something prior to this endeavor to be. I talk about a more original porosity of being, that there's already a givenness of being which has an openness to it, out of which our endeavor to be, our self-affirmation emerges. And that in pursuit of independence, it's quite easy in a certain sense to forget this already given opening of our own being, and indeed treat what simply is given as something to be overcome in the interests of how we determine it to be. So in other words, something that is given to be falls under the shadow of being a heteronomy that limits our own drive to determine ourselves through ourselves alone. Spinoza talks about the essence of a being as its conatus and says that it would proceed to infinity if it wasn't met by a countering conatus. So it's a deeply suggestive view of what it means to be at all, but underlying it is something, again, like what I call the polemical picture. Each thing in its self-affirmation at a certain point will come into opposition with another being that is also a center of, in a certain sense, absolute self-affirmation. And what we have to deal with is the resolution of these forces, sometimes violently, sometimes perhaps in other ways. Now, if there is this prior porosity of being, I want to suggest that there is what I call a passio essendi, a patience of being, prior to the conatus essendi. So there is a being given to be that is more primal than our endeavor to be. We're given to be ourselves before we give ourselves to ourselves. So again, it's not a denial of the fact that human beings, in fact, are self-affirming, and in the unfolding of the energy of self-affirming, they can actually shape themselves in a variety of sometimes astonishing ways. But something more primordial than just self-affirming enables self-affirming itself. And the exploration of that porosity and that passio strikes me as of immense significance in countering what one could take to be, again, the modern univocal definition of freedom that so quickly zones on forms of autonomy. And that potentially also looks at the other, to heteron and heteronomy, in different terms than just the merely negative terms of the passive dependent consciousness over against the independent consciousness. This passio essendi is not just simply a kind of passivity. I like the word the patience of being, that there's a patience in the sense of a pathos to being at all. There's a patience also in the more developed sense of an awaiting and an opening to what offers itself to us. But again, I think that generally the manner in which the modern sense of freedom has been developed has been more in tune with a conatus that rides roughshod over the passio essendi. That the patience of being is something to be overcome, essentially. But in fact, the conatus itself, I would argue, actually emerges out of a prior patience of being, and hence, in a certain sense, it's deforming its own possibilities of being open to what is other to itself, to the extent that it overrides this more primordial patience. Okay. Now, in the further part of my paper, I want to say something about, and again, just some few brief remarks really about different formations of between communities, different formations of the inter. I mentioned them at the beginning. In the family, I think the porosity and the passio, something intimate, is very much at stake. In what, again, a very loose sense, I'm talking about the world of the economy and work and utilitarian striving. The conatus takes over in a certain sense, tending to something more instrumental. In the polity, you have the conatus also, but oriented towards some sense of sovereignty, running the risk at times of tyranny. The problem of tyranny is a very old problem going back to the ancient world, but it's not something that we have avoided in our own time. And finally, in the sense of the religious community, where the notion of passio and porosity can change into something like a compassio essendi, and the notion of what I call agapeic service. So just let me offer a few thoughts on those four, again, as formations of between communities, communities of the Metaxu. So just something about the family. The meaning of interdependence takes different shapes depending on different formations of the inter. It is diversely shaped by different forms of community. The family, I would take it as the most elemental base within which human powers begin to flourish. The child is dependent, again, and taking the notion of dependence and independence, is dependent on parents and carers and will grow to a relative independence, but never in abstraction from interdependence. The inter is especially evident with respect to the fact that we children would be nothing and would become nothing of what we are without the others in intermediation with us. The relation of child to carers, while showing a mutuality, is nevertheless asymmetrical. And again, this is one thing, the notion of asymmetrical intermediations. Very, very important, very interesting. In due course, asymmetrical intermediations can give way to more symmetrical mediations, and indeed to reversals of asymmetry when the parent comes to be in the care of the child or the children. In the family, there is an elemental porosity at work, and the passio essendi is central. There is something of the intimacy of being at work, something in my language that is idiotic. I use this notion of the idiotic, drawing on the Greek sense of the idios, as in some sense out of the more glaring light of the public space. There is a familial piety that anticipates a more fully explicit sacred piety. Now again, of course, desecrations can happen. Most violations of pedophilia, it seems, occur within the family. So there's a saturated equivocity involved in this intimacy of being that's at stake here. Nevertheless, I think one still will, I still would say that there's something elemental about the family as a between community. There's something elemental here, and our later lives are inheritances of this elemental base, which may give us the ground on which later to achieve what lies beyond the family. Though if there are deformations of human power at work here, we may be crippled by these. This seems private, but as is more and more recognized, if the familial intermediation is not healthy, children have greater difficulties all along the way, publicly as well as privately. The love of the other here is crucial, and I mean this first in the sense of receiving love. We are given to ourselves through these others, often in nameless, incognito ways. No child ever knows the full extent of what it has gained from or been given by good parents. The family has everything to do with nourishing young powers in a secure and protected environment. As Hannah Arendt, for instance, wisely pointed out, if we break down the wall between private and public, we can deprive the child of the conditions required for its proper growth. But the ethical intermediation of the family, while private, is more than private. This is clearly an area of concern in our information and cybernetic age, where the boundary between the private and the public is all too permeable, for good sometimes, but also for evil. The intimate as intimate asks for a certain finesse, but the loss of finesse is evident when the difference of the private and public is overridden, for instance, by certain uses of the internet. Parents are not always able or willing to exercise responsible oversight. Grown-ups themselves participate in this dubious overriding. So again, I'm just, the notion of the between, again, if one thinks of the internet, the word inter, that's the thing that I found in my own intellectual journey, is that I focused on the notion of the between very early, and then I began to see betweens everywhere. And I think I would give you the advice to pay attention to the fact that without betweens, there are no connections in the end. And various words begin to pop out at you that in different ways bring home to one its all pervasiveness. That's just a thought on this more intimate level of the passio and the porosity. And again, as I say, we can take this up in question time in more detail. The second sense of the inter, let me just connect it with the network of utility that often does constitute our sense of the economy and the world of work. When we turn to the world of work, we deal with the social intermediations of powers beyond the intimate. Economic relations at a deep level are based on communications, and not only on what we call the service economy. To give and receive, to make, to exchange and sell, all of these are communicative intermediations between many human beings. Intermediations not devoid of ethical charge. We cannot understand these social intermediations without attention to the inter of multiple forms of interdependence. Again, we're not just here dealing with will to power, though human powers can be instrumentalized. Here in the more public world, the other is often the stranger, to whom we relate with a mixture of trust and distrust. In the agon of dependence and independence, the instrumental relation is unavoidable, which is not to say it is all that there is. Human beings need to use things to be, to preserve and to perpetuate themselves. What is of value here tends towards the useful. Useful means to ends otherwise deemed worthy. While modernity has lifted the burden of work for many, we also live more massively in the world of work than perhaps at any other time. I mean that the intermediation of utility is now global through and through. Modern democratic societies tend to be very utilitarian. Information technology is developed for its usefulness, for instrumental purposes. often tied to economic profit. An important issue is to what degree this dominance of instrumental purposes functions as the decisive influence on all areas of human life, reformulating them in its own image and likeness. The useful is necessary, but not everything necessary is useful, in the sense of serving as a means to our ends only. In our time, a danger is that we fall too much under the influence of unconstrained instrumental attitudes, ending up in a society where worth and value are defined by what I do call serviceable disposability. Serviceable disposability. Now, what I mean by this is that the value of a thing is alone its use for us, and we, us, are defined by some of the characteristics outlined at the outset. We demand immediate relevance, we who are impatiently caught up in a foreshortened view of time, and so on. So again, the notion of the patience of being comes in here, but I just mentioned it in passing. Things are serviceable, but they service us. They are disposable. Once used, they are used up, and further than that for us, useless. Persons are themselves treated in terms of serviceable disposability. Human resources that are to serve their use, but once they have done so, are used up and disposable. Now, again, this is a complex matter, but I would suggest that use is made possible by the fact that things are there on offer for us. Things are there, yes, and in a sense give themselves before they are used by us. In our desire to be independent, we are first dependent on this givenness. And even if we believe we surpass the givenness, an interdependence between us and other being never entirely disappears. Things are available, present themselves as available, that is disposable in another sense. I'm thinking of Gabriel Marcel, his sense of disponibilité, something offers itself in the modality of a gift. Succinctly put, gift subtends use. What we receive from the bounty of creation or the world precedes our creation of our own wealth from the givenness of things. Ethical education has to do not only with the necessary practical skills, but also with the fostering of mindfulness of this givenness and receptivity, and hence operates in the name of services that are not just a matter of serviceable disposability. There are services beyond serviceable disposability. There are intermediations beyond dependence and independence. The givenness that allows the mutation of the useful is impossible without the prior porosity of being and the reception of being in the passio ascendi. But the gift of these latter is overridden in the instrumentalization of the endeavor to be, the conatus ascendi, in its will to call the shots in its game of determining what is other and insisting on its own self-determination. A third form of community, between community, again, I know I'm speaking very broadly, but I have written more extensively, if that can be taken as an excuse for my quick survey here today. Further than the more intimate values we often associate with the family and personal relations, and beyond the values of usefulness we associate with work and economics, there are values of public character that bear on what a community deems as of intrinsic worth in immanently defining itself. In Ethics and the Between, I talk about this as the community of erotic sovereignty. But what I mean by erotic is not just sexual, at least and least of all erotic in the coarsened, not to say debased form that is more and more prevalent. I mean something like the erotic, the Greek sense of eros. The full sweep of human desire and self-transcending is at stake. Self-surpassing desire seeking excellence, and in some exemplary instances actually attaining some achieved excellence. Sovereignty also carries connotations of a kind of independence, such as we note with claims of sovereignty claimed by states which assert for themselves a strong claim to self-governance. Nevertheless, there is no sovereignty without the inter. Thus, what I mean by erotic sovereignty has to do with the circulation of social power and the communal intermediation of intrinsic or immanent excellence. This is not defined simply by instrumental utility, though in its own way it may be eminently useful. I hesitate to enter into a family quarrel here, but some of the reflections on erotic sovereignty and immanent excellence clearly have relevance to the Brexit debate. How they have relevance, I don't know. And I would not dare to offer an opinion. But one understands that people sometimes thinks of itself in terms that do transcend serviceable disposability. And if one absolutizes serviceable disposability, that transcendence is just simply mad. Doesn't fit into the logic of the situation. If serviceable disposability stresses an instrumental conatus that tends to override the passio, erotic sovereignty is tempted to free a passion that tends to override the passio. I mean in the paradoxical form of passion overriding the patience of being. Because again, the quest for sovereignty, I think, can take that form of self-affirmation, whether of an individual or a people, which in fact, as I put it here, runs roughshod over that more originally given patience of being. But I do think actually that there can be images of achieved excellence that give us some sense that are beyond the sphere of the instrumental. For instance, the sovereignty of a great work of art or artist. Again, these are individual examples here of a great athlete who plays not just for professional success, but for glory. Glory is a mark of sovereignty. The philosopher might exhibit sovereignty in thought that shows freedom beyond utility. More usual sovereignties concern the intermediation of social and political powers through its leaders, motivated by a community of purpose beyond instrumental goals. Immanent excellence of this sort was at the center of some of the great political societies of the past. Today, one might ask if we see sovereignty too much through the eyes of serviceable disposability. Is service of the economy first, or first service of the people, or of the economy as a means of that overriding service? There are public services, civil services beyond serviceable disposability. Now, and again, a last thought on that here is that there is a kind of equivocity in this quest for erotic sovereignty insofar as the erotic, and again, I find it remarkable that the Greeks already anticipated two different kinds of eros. There's an eros which is a more heavenly eros, and there's eros tyrannos. So there's something potentially tyrannical about the erotic in the sense of the self-transcending sweep of the human being, which can turn into a form of will to power in which what is other to itself, in fact, is basely instrumentalized. And I think this, of course, is the temptation of political power always. There's something equivocal about it, and in fact, one of the great questions that we often have in connection with that equivocity is the question of trust. So to come now to the last formation, I call it the community of agapeic service, opens up forms of freedom of being free or being freed. And again, that the difference between being free as self-determination and being freed as somehow only released in relation to what is other to oneself, perhaps being released by what is other to oneself. Those second forms of freedom have not always been given their due. I'm talking about something at the boundary between the ethical and the religious. Beyond immanent excellence, we are pointed to some sense of transcendent worth, expressed in what I call the community of agapeic service. This is not serviceable disposability or political sovereignty. Neither sovereign nor servile. What is at issue is the between of an ethical service that extends beyond itself for the good of the other. It is less concerned with things or other human beings as serviceable for us, but of our being in the service of a good that transcends us, and in an intimate sense. One notes a call to transform the uses and celebrations of power such that our temptation to close in on ourselves in self-justification is challenged. The theme here might seem Christian, but this service is not confined to one religious tradition. It also sounds like a mere ideal, but I think that in a deep sense there is a service of generosity at the core of all communications of value. This communication is at the heart of the family, of teaching, of useful service honestly rendered, of political power responsibly exercised. This kind of transcendence is incognito at work in all the other intermediations of value. The intimate generosity we can find in the family, the receptiveness to gift that is presupposed by use, even though immediately covered over by the same use, the need to be given to oneself by a more mature other before one is able to realize what are one's own higher excellences, one's indebtedness to the justice of a political community for the enabling opportunities that allow one's powers to flourish. There is a certain surplus of good at work incognito that makes possible all the other communal intermediations of value, but that here is more overt. And I'll give the example of a teacher, being a teacher. And just to summarize, you do things as a teacher that don't fall within serviceable disposability. And they're not also simply a question of the reflected glory of your own erotic sovereignty. So to return to and close with the theme of interdependence. Here too the contrast, once again, the contrast of dependence and independence is not to be eschewed, but relativized with respect to interdependences. Some more mutually symmetrical, some more asymmetrical. Dependence and independence are to be aligned with an interdependence that sometimes is an intermediation that is mutual, but sometimes also allows an intermediation wherein there is a generosity of giving that is asymmetrical in the sense that the gift is given just because of the good of the gift. It is not first given in light of its return in a mutual symmetrical mediation. This is not the essential point. The giving may be returned, it may not be, and yet it is given because the giving is itself the giving of the good. If one were to speak theologically and to echo some initial remarks I made about Aquinas, this would be first and foremost a giving of the inter itself as a space of porosity to all other relative created gifts. I mean the gift of creation. Logics of determination or self-determination, and indeed a logic of symmetrical mutual determination, are inadequate to this giving if it issues freely from a too-muchness, a fullness already real in itself, not in search of a further fulfillment for itself. It is given for the other qua other. There is something hyperbolic about it that we might struggle to articulate on the terms of dependency, independency, interdependency. There is always more. This is, one supposes, divine giving, and recalls us to the different senses of community I outlined at the outset with Aquinas. The absolute community as the Metaxu of agape between the persons of the divinity, communicating the gift of being. All else and all other forms of between community are ontologically dependent on this giving source. These dependent between communities can give rise to relative forms of independence and interdependence, coming to a head with the community of agapeic service as the divine community, or inter, in which humans are given to participate. Surreptitiously, or perhaps graciously, we find ourselves in the end, as in the beginning, companioned by Aquinas. Thank you for your patience.